Did an Oxford professor steal ancient artifacts and sell them to the US arts and craft giant Hobby Lobby for millions of dollars?
And Hobby Lobby has filed a federal lawsuit claiming they were sold stolen biblical artifacts.
Hobby Lobby says they purchased more than $7 million worth of artifacts from Obbink, who stole the artifacts from the Egyptian Exploration Society.
They are essentially propping up a market from which terrorist organizations can benefit.
It's February 1st, 2012, and inside a packed auditorium at the University of North Carolina, two New Testament scholars, Dr. Bart Ehrman and Dr. Daniel B. Wallace, are debating whether the original text of the New Testament has been lost.
How many manuscripts of the New Testament do we have from the first Christian century? None.
Wallace, at the end of his opening statement, dropped a bombshell about the discovery of a new ancient text.
The oldest manuscript of the New Testament is now a fragment from Mark's Gospel that is from the first century. Well, my source is a papyrologist who worked on this manuscript, a man whose reputation is unimpeachable. Many consider him to be the best papyrologist on the planet. His reputation is on the line with this dating, and he knows it, but he is certain that this manuscript was from the first century.
Papyrus is a writing material used in ancient times, similar to paper. There are no surviving papyrus texts of the New Testament from the same century Jesus lived. If this was true, it was a monumental discovery, and it was just announced for the first time in the middle of a debate. Scholars from around the world wanted to know, was this true? If so, who was this secret expert? Wallace said the manuscript would be released by the academic publisher Brill, and sure enough, later that year they announced a volume of rare, unpublished papyrus texts from the Green collection. So this first century papyrus must have been owned by the Greens. The Greens are a conservative family who own Hobby Lobby, a multi-billion-dollar chain of arts and crafts stores in the United States. Steve Green is the president of the company. The Greens were embarking on a new venture.
And welcome to Washington's newest museum. This is the Museum of the Bible, the privately funded Museum of the Bible founded by the Hobby Lobby's Green family.
430,000 square feet. The Museum of the Bible here in Washington, D.C.
To build the museum's collection, Hobby Lobby purchased artifacts and donated them to the museum. Between 2009 and 2013, Steve Green would purchase over 40,000 artifacts, including Dead Sea Scrolls and ancient tablets. So if this first century fragment from the Gospel of Mark belonged to the Greens, how did they get their hands on it? Enter Scott Carroll. Carroll was a big personality. He was often called
the Indiana Jones of biblical antiquities.
In 2010, Carroll was put in charge of acquisitions for Hobby Lobby's Bible Museum. Carroll had a brazen approach to handling ancient artifacts that left many archaeologists appalled. In ancient Egypt, mummified corpses often had masks made of cartonnage, a papier-mâché type material made from plaster, linen, and old papyrus texts. Carroll used a controversial method called dismounting, where he washed the mask with dish soap and water, enabling him to separate the texts. This method is widely condemned by experts.
When I saw this, I think my heart just about dropped.
This is Dr. Kip Davis, a leading expert on the Dead Sea Scrolls, who has worked hands-on with ancient papyrus.
To see the cavalier nature of like plunging these ancient mummy masks into like tubs of water and you know, massaging them with the soap and everything, it's astonishing to me that that things were handled so carelessly. The only way to access these texts was to destroy the artifact, which has its own very important cultural significance. It was extremely upsetting to archaeologists that I know.
On January 16, 2012, at Baylor University, Carroll demonstrated the dismounting of an ancient mummy mask for staff and students. He took one of these ancient mummy masks and washed it in warm water and dish soap. He then separated a layer of papyrus from the mask. Upon closer examination, it turned out to be a fragment of the Book of Romans. Everyone was shocked and amazed, except Dr. David Jeffrey, a fellow scholar at Baylor. When Jeffrey had walked into the room earlier, he had seen a fragment of papyrus sitting next to the sink. He recognized it as the one Carroll had discovered in front of the class. Carroll had only pretended to pull it from the mask. Only 48 hours later, Steve Green was on CNN promoting the newly discovered Romans fragment.
It's a portion of the book of Romans. On one side is a portion of the chapter 9, and the other side is a portion of the chapter 10 of the book of Romans. And what's interesting is this has just been discovered within the last 48 hours. Dr. Scott Carroll, who is the Bible expert that we have been working with, was at Baylor and discovered this.
But Carroll hadn't made this discovery 48 hours prior. In fact, the fragment had been purchased by the Hobby Lobby from Oxford professor Dirk Obbink. Obbink was a world-renowned expert on ancient Greek literature who had received millions of dollars of funding over the course of his career. Obbink was put in charge of editing the largest collection of papyri from the ancient world, held at Oxford University in the UK. Months prior to Carroll's show at Baylor University, Carroll and another colleague had travelled to Oxford to meet Obbink. They were there to discuss Obbink's latest work, but as the two got up to leave, Obbink stopped them to show them one more thing. What Obbink had in his possession amazed Carroll. This was a fragment of Mark's Gospel, one which Obbink explained had the hallmarks of 1st century writing, the very same one Wallace would later sing the praises of in his debate.
Well, my source is a papyrologist who worked on this manuscript, a man whose reputation is unimpeachable.
Obbink informed Carroll that it belonged to a private family collection and was available for sale to the Hobby Lobby. How did Obbink get access to such incredible ancient manuscripts, and who was this mysterious family that owned them? Obbink would start to work directly with Hobby Lobby after Scott Carroll was fired in May of 2012. Carroll had pulled more stunts with his mummy masks. In a 2012 lecture, he showed off new fragments of poems from the ancient Greek poet Sappho, which he claimed to pull out of a mummy mask.
There are 26 fragments of this text in Greek, on papyrus, and it came out of a mummy mask I dismantled a few weeks ago.
But this was a lie. These Sappho fragments were actually sold to the Greens months earlier through a Turkish dealer who also had connections to Obbink. And this was 2 years before the discovery of new fragments of Sappho poetry would make international news. When scholars at Baylor took a closer look at Carroll's resume, they found several of the books he had claimed to author didn't even exist. After Carroll was fired, the Greens employed Obbink directly. From 2013, Obbink was paid $6,000 a month from the Museum of the Bible. In that same year, a contract of sale signed by Obbink would show he officially sold the 1st century fragment of Mark to the Hobby Lobby. But here's where things start to unravel. In 2014, Obbink purchased Cottonland Castle in Waco, Texas, an extravagant property with which he planned over $1 million in renovations. The renovator Obbink hired wondered how he could afford such a project on an academic salary. As it turns out, he wasn't the only one asking questions. Obbink was in charge of an enormous collection of papyri at Oxford. This collection was owned by the Egyptian Exploration Society, or EES. The EES grew concerned about Obbink's relationship with the Greens, and they asked him to cut all ties. Obbink promised that he had, but in reality he was still on the payroll, receiving $6,000 a month. The EES learned that Carroll had met Obbink to buy the 1st century Mark papyrus from him, and this had them worried. They started combing through their collection looking for unpublished New Testament manuscripts, and sure enough, in their collection was the very same fragment from Mark's Gospel. The EES confronted Obbink about this, and he assured them that while he did show it off, he never offered it for sale. To stave off any more claims of impropriety, the EES demanded Obbink publish the Mark fragment as soon as possible. This was a dilemma. As soon as he published it, it would come out that the EES owned the fragment, which meant that the Greens would find out that it was never his to sell. Meanwhile, the Museum of the Bible started their own investigation. Their director, David Trowbridge, travelled to Oxford to ask Obbink about the papyri he had sold to the Greens. Obbink promised he could get them the official paperwork showing the origins of the manuscripts, but it never materialised. Then, in 2018, after it could be delayed no longer, the new fragment of the Gospel of Mark was published. The headline was that this much-hyped manuscript was not, in fact, from the 1st century, but rather the late 2nd or early 3rd centuries. But the revelation that the EES were the real owners caused chaos behind the scenes. A representative from the Museum of the Bible provided the EES a contract of sale, which allegedly showed Obbink had sold not just one, but several fragments from the EES collection, which Obbink had claimed were his personal property. Each one was worth millions. They contended that Obbink had sold the Museum of the Bible ancient manuscripts which did not belong to him. The EES acted quickly. They banned Obbink from their collection. A report by The Atlantic claimed Obbink had sold 15 fragments from the EES collection to the Museum of the Bible for over $1.5 million, including the Roman scrap that Carol had pulled out of the soapy water. Further investigation revealed more stolen texts had made their way into the hands of private collections around the United States. The thief had removed the inventory cards and the corresponding photographs of the stolen items from the EES catalogue, but little did they know copies of the catalogue existed in multiple locations. Around 120 items were missing from the EES collection. But how could Obbink work on publishing the manuscripts in Oxford when they were sold to the Hobby Lobby in the United States? As it turns out, Obbink had a very strange clause in the contract of sale. There was to be no public announcement of the acquisition, and Obbink could not be named as the seller. He would also remain in possession of the fragment for 4 years. Only then would it be delivered to the Greens. Obbink denies any wrongdoing. In a statement made in October 2020, he says,
"The allegations made against me that I have stolen, removed, or sold items owned by the Egyptian Exploration Society collection at the University of Oxford are entirely false. I would never betray the trust of my colleagues and the values which I have sought to protect and uphold throughout my academic career in the way that has been alleged."
He goes on to allege that he was framed.
"I am aware that there are documents being used against me, which I believe have been fabricated in a malicious attempt to harm my reputation and career. I am working with my legal team in this regard."
Obbink was dismissed from his positions at Oxford and would fall behind on payments for his Waco castle, which was how it wound up in the hands of Chip and Joanna Gaines behind the show Fixer Upper.
This castle is one of the most impressive properties in the entire Waco, Central Texas area, and I've wanted it for 2 decades now.
In March of 2020, Obbink was arrested on suspicion of theft. He was released after questioning, and the investigation is still ongoing. As for Hobby Lobby, this isn't the first time they have been involved in the purchase of stolen goods.
In 2017, the company was slapped with a multi-million-dollar fine after importing Iraqi artifacts the Department of Justice claims were looted.
In 2010, Hobby Lobby was building a collection of biblical artifacts. Hobby Lobby's expert advised them to be careful about acquiring Iraqi cultural property. She warned them that cuneiform tablets and cylinder seals were particularly popular on the market and likely to have been looted. The story should have ended there, but it did not. Instead, Hobby Lobby went ahead and bought the artifacts for approximately $1.6 million.
Federal prosecutors in the United States seized shipments of ancient tablets from Iraq purchased by Hobby Lobby. They had provided false information about the shipment, claiming they were ceramic tile samples from Turkey and Israel. Hobby Lobby were fined $3 million and 5,500 artifacts were returned to Iraq. In a 2017 interview, Candida Moss explains how Hobby Lobby were likely contributors to black market trade.
Whenever you have a collector or an institution participating in the black market for antiquities, they are essentially propping up and perpetuating a market from which terrorist organizations can benefit.
Stealing a nation's cultural property is one of the oldest forms of organized transnational crimes that many times funds terrorist activities.
But Hobby Lobby are also on the offensive. They are currently suing Dirk Obbink for $7 million over failure to return the money for the falsified sales. The lawsuit alleges that between 2010 and 2013, Obbink sold them a total of 32 items that were actually owned by the Egyptian Exploration Society. In the lawsuit, they state,
"The fact that some unknown number of the fragments were stolen renders all the fragments unsaleable and worthless to Hobby Lobby, which stands to lose both the fragments and the entire value of the purchase price it paid to Obbink."
However, Hobby Lobby typically gains far more value from the ancient artifacts they buy than the purchase price, thanks to their exploitation of a tax loophole. The Greens own Hobby Lobby and the Museum of the Bible, but the two are legally distinct entities. So Hobby Lobby purchases the artifacts and then donates them to the Museum of the Bible. But Hobby Lobby can claim a tax write-off for the donation, and the artifact remains under their control through the museum.
I had heard about, this procedure that they had in place of buying things, getting them appraised, and then donating them to the museum and collecting the tax write-off. How does one go about appraising like a one-of-a-kind article, right? And my expectation, right, was that appraisal was something that was undertaken by experts, by people who knew what they were looking at. But when it came to attaching value to artifacts, he says this is all done by lawyers. And basically, all a lawyer does is investigates the market and determines what somebody would potentially be willing to pay, and then they can assign that value to it. So they were buying things cheap, running them through this appraisal, which would dramatically escalate the perceived value of these items, and that's the number that they would be able to claim on their tax returns.
Scott Carroll spoke to Joel Baden and Candida Moss, the authors of Bible Nation, about how the museum would buy decommissioned Torah scrolls for $1,000 to $1,500 and have them appraised on average for $70,000 apiece. By purchasing artifacts, having them appraised at a higher value, and then donating them, the organization saves millions in tax write-offs. Steve Green even admits as much. When asked by Baden and Moss how the family decides what to donate, he responds candidly,
"I don't know that there's a lot of rhyme and reason to it. We want to donate X amount and we can do it with this. And that's easy, so we'll do it."
On March 11 of 2024, an Oklahoma City court gave a default judgment in favor of Hobby Lobby against Obbink, ordering him to pay $7,085,100. The judgment notes that the defendant, Dirk Obbink, had failed to appear, plead, or otherwise defend in this action. There is some good news. As of 2024, it has been reported by Dr. Roberta Maza that all of the 120 stolen fragments have been recovered by the EES. However, the investigation into who stole them and how is currently in its 5th year, and we still don't know whether Dirk Obbink was involved or whether he is truly being framed. Only time will tell.